Okay, so this is the first lecture for EC2101. It is not actually the recording of the first lecture. This is a recording made subsequent to the first lecture, but covers the material that was taken in the first class in the Friday of the first term. So it's an introductory to some of the basic concepts and principles of economics. If you've taken a course in economics before, you'll be familiar with these. If you haven't taken a course in economics before, it's an introduction. Some of the basic concepts we use as economists. Here are some readings which are a kind of introductory look at some of the concepts of economics, and these are posted to the Blackboard website, and as are some questions which relate to the material we're covering. The first thing we'll note is that economics is everywhere. While as a subject economics might have a certain resonance with society when looking at financial issues or macroeconomic issues or issues in relation to the government. In fact, from an economist's perspective, economics is everywhere. Economics applies to every member of society, and not just economists or students of economics. So it's not just necessarily the study of macroeconomic aggregates of inflation, unemployment, interest rates, etc. Economics is involved in our everyday existence. Economics can help to understand, explain, analyse, and indeed forecast the actions of individuals. And if you look at where the word economics come from, economics is derived from the Greek phrase oikon nomos, which essentially means domestic financial rules or household management. So it starts at a very low or basic level, the actions of individuals and households, and from there then it has worked up. Alfred Marshall, the author of a famous textbook in economics back in 1890, the textbook that introduced the supply and demand cross diagram, of which I'm sure most of you are very familiar. In that he defined economics as the study of mankind in the ordinary business of life. So again, it was the everyday actions of individuals going around their ordinary business. Individuals as consumers, individuals as workers, individuals as investors, individuals on their leisure, whatever it might be, just the everyday actions of individuals was what the business of economics was about. And the concept of this course, a microeconomics course, we'll be looking at behaviour from the individual level, and we're looking at interaction, then we look at behaviour in groups, before working up then to more formal groups such as firms and markets, etc. So our basis will be the individual, and a lot of the examples we'll draw will be the ordinary business of life, the decisions, the choices that people make, and the options and incentives that they face that drive those choices. So that'll be the guiding principle as we work through it. So here we'll look at 8 basic economic principles. We'll just work through a couple of them today and conclude then with the next class. So the first basic principle is that individuals behave on internal self-interest, and this basically is that people do what they want to do, and as economists we don't make judgments on preferences, we don't rank preferences of one individual over another. We just take the preferences of individuals as given. One thing you'll note there is that we don't assume that individuals behave based on selfishness. There is perhaps a perception out there that the basic principle of economics is that, as famously described by Gordon Gekko back in the original Wall Street movie back in the 1980s, that greed is good. Well, there may be some people out there for whom selfishness is their internal self-interest, and again we have no issue with that as long as they behave based on their set of preferences. That ties in fully to most economic models. What we don't assume is that people are selfish. If we did assume that the starting point of all economic behavioural models was selfishness, well then we could throw them out with one or two simple examples. It's most extreme if you said that the starting principle of economics is selfishness. A simple counter-example such as Mother Teresa would banish all economic models to the bin. Somebody would simply say, well, here's one person who doesn't act selfishly, in fact acts selflessly, operating for the service and betterment of others. So how does this fit in with your models? So the important issue here is that we don't assume that people act selfishly. We assume they act in their self-interest. They do what's best for them. So whether it's a Goring Gecko type individual who wants to make themselves as well off as possible, and maybe at the cost of others, or even possibly would want it at the cost of others, to somebody who acts selflessly, such as Mother Teresa, who wants to serve others, they all fit in under the concept of self-interest. People are doing what they want to do. They're making themselves as well off as possible, given the set of preferences they have, whether it is the acquisition of material wealth or providing benefits to others. From an economics perspective, these are equally valid preferences. All we assume is that people behave and act on the basis of those preferences, and that they try to make themselves as well off as possible. So as soon as we have certain judgments about what people do, we can begin to make forecasts about how people might behave in certain situations. But we don't have a starting principle of a particular set of preferences. We just assume that people have preferences and they act on the basis of those. Then, once we have the concept of the internal self-interest or internal preferences, we then look and focus on the external environment. So people then respond to external incentives. So people have whatever preferences they have, but then they must mold those preferences around the external environment. So the factors that influence their decision can also come from the external environment. One of the simplest incentives we have in economics, one of the easiest to grasp, is the concept of prices. That if you want a particular good or service, you must pay for it. If something becomes more expensive, people will demand less of it. And from our perspective in Ireland, we can see the impact of incentives and with some government decisions. So one of the simplest to consider is the plastic bag levy. So up to 7 or 8 years ago, plastic bags in Ireland were free. Anyone that went to the shop for a litre of milk or a loaf of bread or a pound of butter would virtually always take a plastic bag at the end of the transaction. And billions upon billions of these bags were used on an annual basis in Ireland. And there was costs of dumping these, costs of creating the dumping ground, the very long life of such plastic bags, and the littering problem, where many of them ended up tossed on the side of the road. So way back about 7 or 8 years ago, it was decided to impose a small charge on the use of plastic bags. So initially the charge came in, the plastic bag levy, at 12 cents per bag. And this had a huge impact on the demand and use for plastic bags. So we can assume that people still had the same preferences, that they still would have taken a bag as they would have before. The people hadn't changed, but the external environment had changed. They were now being charged 12 cents for each bag, and this outweighed their preference. The preference to hold on to the 12 cent meant they would carry the items out of the shop if they only had a few, or as the vast majority of people now do, bring their own bag to the shop. And it has reduced the consumption of such plastic bags by a huge amount, over 95%. The levy has been increased in recent times and is due to be increased again, but it did serve as an incentive to change behaviour. So the government can use prices to influence outcomes. So here it influenced the demand for a product. So clearly there were benefits to using plastic bags, but those benefits were very small. As soon as a small charge was imposed, the demand and usage of those plastic bags dropped off considerably. Incentives don't necessarily have to be monetary. If you look at the government campaign around drink driving and speeding, there are instances where the government's tried to increase the cost, but in some instances the government tries to influence moral incentives to get people to change their behaviour based on how they feel about the behaviour. So for example, with driving, you see the campaign where somebody's involved or causes a traffic accident that leads to death or serious injury to somebody, and the punchline at the end of the ad is, can you live with the shame? Again, trying to change the incentives the person faces, trying to change the cost of a particular behaviour. In this instance, trying to get people to realise the cost of a particular behaviour. So we'll assume that people still have the same preference for speeding, driving fast, driving dangerously, but if you can change the cost of it, just like with plastic bags, you might be able to change the level of it that takes place. So the government has also tried to change the costs of speeding with the introduction of penalty points, fines, mobile speed vans, etc., all trying to change the incentives that people face. That if you do speed, maybe you're more likely to get caught. That if you do speed now, it's not just a monetary fine, there's penalty points, and once you hit 12 points, you lose your license for a particular period of time. So again, trying to change the environment in which people operate. You can difficulty in trying to get people to change their behaviour by just asking them. You must go out and actually change the environment in which they operate, so they can change the moral incentives. In some instances, it could be trying to change social incentives. So there's a different reaction to drink driving amongst people who are aged between 55 and 65, as opposed to those who are aged between 25 and 35. The social acceptance of drink driving in Ireland has changed over the last 25 or 30 years, with a greater acceptance of it amongst older people and almost complete abhorrence of it amongst younger people. So there has been a change in the environment in which it takes place, that now there's, while still we won't say that it's a zero level of drink driving among younger people, it is far lower than it would have been previously. And this again is based on campaigns, changing the environment in which people operate, and changing the social stigma associated with particular actions. So the incentives can either be monetary, they can be social, or they can be moral. And they don't necessarily have to be changed by government. Of course, it's in firms' interests to try and get as much profit out of people as possible. So again, they can influence prices, try to get information out there that either promotes their product or limits information on others, offer special offers, and a whole host of other actions that try to get people to behave in a particular manner. Change the incentives in which they operate, and you can change the behaviour. With these incentives comes the concept that people face trade-offs. We make choices. So the whole reason that prices work is simply because we don't have unlimited income. If you had unlimited income, the price of something in money terms wouldn't really matter. But because your income is limited, you must make choices. €10 you spent on one product is €10 you can't spend on something else. There is a cost to choosing one good over another. So people face trade-offs. You trade one opportunity over another. Choosing to spend your money on one product means a loss of opportunity elsewhere. So technically it's what's called opportunity cost. I suppose most famously described in Robert Burns' poem, where two paths diverge in the yellow wood. By choosing one, you cannot choose the other. So if you come to a fork in the road, you can go left or right. You cannot go left and right. So two paths diverged in the yellow wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. Whether it is or didn't is hard to know, but a choice was faced. There was an opportunity cost. By choosing to go down one path, you're giving up the opportunity to go down the other. And this, I suppose, is best encapsulated in the phrase that has the letters Tinstafel. And this represents the phrase, there is no such thing as a free lunch. So every decision has costs. So if somebody decides to offer you a free lunch, I'll meet you next Tuesday at a particular venue, a particular location, and I'll buy you lunch. That is not a free lunch. Next Tuesday you could go somewhere else. You're giving up the opportunity to do something else with that time. So just like income and wealth are limited, time is limited. So choosing time to go to this particular venue is a lost opportunity. And if somebody's willing to buy you a free lunch, you can be fairly certain that they want something from you. But the opportunity cost of the free lunch is the ability to be somewhere else, to engage in a different activity. So while you might be getting the lunch for free, you are losing out on something else. So people face trade-offs, face opportunity cost, and this is what makes incentives all the more powerful. Because by choosing one action or one product, you're giving up another opportunity or another product. And there's a whole host of choices that must be made on a daily basis to get up at 11 o'clock for a lecture or stay in bed for an extra hour, to get an early bus home, to go home and get fed, or to stay for the extra hour. All during the week you face choices when it comes to Friday morning, how to do with the last few euro in your pocket, whatever it might be, where the choice is involved in choosing amongst the resources you have. So resources are scarce. It's not just natural resources that are scarce, all resources are scarce, and it's scarcity that drives economic decisions. If there was no if there was no scarcity, there would be no economic decisions. You could just choose to do whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted, at no cost or consequence. But that's not the way reality works, and there are substantial opportunity costs. When it comes to considering these incentives and opportunity costs, we must appreciate that decisions are made at the margin. In economics, we have a particular definition of what the margin is. The margin is the next or the extra. So the marginal cost is the next cost, the cost of the next unit. The marginal price is how much do I pay for the next unit. The marginal profit is how much do I make on the next unit. So decisions are made at the margin. Decisions are made moving from the current position into the next position. So you don't look back at sunk costs or what's happened previously. You look forward. How much utility or satisfaction can I get by buying another unit of this product? How much profit can I make by selling another unit? It's all about looking at the subsequent unit. So decisions are made at the margin. And it's important to realise the impact that margins and marginal prices can have when considering what particular outcomes are. So to take an example from a book by Tim Harford, where he looked at a particular situation in the first week of term of a university, where the Students' Union were running events in the first week of term that ended up with a lot of drunkenness around the university, which university president wished to see reduced. So the Students' Union ran the event on the first Tuesday. The president was looking around and saw students after consuming huge amounts of alcohol, and summons the president of the Students' Union to ask what was going on. And the Students' Union said, look, we're running these events for students first week of term, just to get people back into it. Drink is available, yes, but it's €20 to get into the event for somebody who wishes to have a drink, and it's a £5 to get in for somebody who doesn't wish to have a drink. And when somebody gets in, they can then drink based on their entry ticket, whether they have a ticket that allows them to drink alcohol or one that allows them to drink as much orange juice as they want. So the president said, look, this drinking has to stop. Drinking has to become more expensive. Because it's at €20, there's just too much of it happening. If you're running this event on Thursday night, I want the price of drink increased. So the Students' Union run the event again on the Thursday night and increase the price of alcohol tickets or drinking tickets to €30, and the price of the non-alcoholic or orange juice tickets remains at €5. Again, they pack out the venue, and the president looks out again and sees students falling around the place, and perhaps even more students falling around the place, riddled with drink, and wondering what the hell is going on. So summons the president of the Students' Union in again and says, look, did you make drink cheaper? What's after happening? And the Students' Union president says, no, in fact we upped the price 50%. The price of getting into the event to drink went from €20 to €30. We've made drinking more expensive. Of course, from an economic perspective, they actually haven't made drinking more expensive. As we know and now know, decisions are made at the margin. What people respond to is the cost, price and benefit of the next unit. They don't respond to average prices. So while the Students' Union might have increased the average price of drink, so if somebody goes in and has 5 drinks on a €20 ticket, the average price is €4. If they pay €20 for the ticket, the average price of those 5 drinks is now €6. But the average price makes no difference. When somebody pays the €20 or the €30 and gets into the event, the price of drink is free. The marginal cost is 0. Whether they have 2, 3, 4, 7, 8 or 10 drinks, there is no additional cost. That once they get into the event and have access to the drink supplies that are there, they can have as much as they want. And changing the price of entry from 20 to 30 euro will have little effect on the amount of drinking that takes place. There may be some people for whom the increase from 20 to 30 euro will mean they will change from the drinking to the non-drinking ticket. Rather than buying a 30 euro ticket for access to drink, they will buy the 5 euro non-drinking ticket. That will take place in some instances. But then the vast majority of people will probably decide to purchase the 30 euro ticket and have access to the drink. And then once they purchase the 30 euro ticket, the price of drink is zero. And in fact, after paying 30 euro, some may well decide that they're going to get value of it and drink even more. So when the president looks out of his window and sees even more students falling around the place, paralytic with drink, it'll run counterintuitive to the decisions that were made to actually increase the price of drinking. But of course they didn't do that at all. All they simply increased was the price of entry, ignoring the fact that decisions are made at the margin. If you wanted to reduce drinking, you have to increase the price of drinking, not increase the price of getting into a party. And this is a similar situation that occurred in an Irish context, where we've had the success of the plastic bag levy in reducing usage of plastic bags. There have been some instances where the changes were introduced have not maybe fully met the objectives that were laid out. So under the previous government there was changes to tax laws for cars. So the government was looking at CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, and the perceived impact these have on the environment. So under the previous government, changes were made to vehicle registration tax, which can be up to 20% of the price of a new car. So you buy a 20 grand new car, you could be paying 4 grand or more in VRT to get a license plate on that car. And then the annual motor tax. But just like our president, who was influenced in trying to change drinking behaviour, the government was trying to look at CO2 emissions. So just like buying a ticket for a party doesn't make somebody drunk, buying a car doesn't create CO2 emissions. It is drinking that leads to drunkenness. And in our university example, they did not change the price of drinking. The marginal price of a drink remained at zero. When the previous government changed the VRT, the vehicle registration tax on cars, just like the president, cars don't create CO2. Cars do not lead to carbon dioxide emissions. It is driving cars that leads to CO2 emissions. So by changing the VRT and moving it from a situation where it's related to engine size, so under the previous VRT regime, a 1.8 litre car had a higher tax than a 1.2 or 1.4 litre car. Under the new regime, they're linked to carbon emissions, efficiency of the car, the emissions produced per kilo of fuel, I think, is the standard used by car manufacturers. So in this instance, more efficient cars who can convert more of the energy into motion rather than into carbon dioxide emissions had a lower VRT. But if your objective is to lower VRT, like somebody could buy a gas guzzling huge monster that is very inefficient, but if they only drive it twice a year, what does it matter whether they've purchased it? They're not creating CO2 emissions. Somebody else then could buy the most efficient car in the market and drive up and down to Dublin every day. Even though they have a more efficient car, they are leading to more CO2 emissions. So it's not the cars per se that lead to CO2 emissions, it's driving. If your objective is to reduce CO2 emissions, you must increase the price of driving. If you're a university president and you want to reduce drinking, you must increase the price of drinking. People respond to marginal prices. So even with the changes in VRT, the cost of running a car is the marginal price, making the journey. So once somebody has the car, they're still free to drive as much as they want. Once somebody had the drinking ticket, they were free to drink as much as they want. So the important thing to note is that decisions are made at the margin, that you must change the cost of the next action, the cost of the next drink, the cost of the next drive. Unless you achieve that, you won't set out the objectives of your, or meet the objectives of your change. So perhaps the previous government just wanted to raise revenue, and it could have had an impact, or that would have been a direct result of the change. But if their objective was to reduce CO2 emissions, they weren't necessarily targeting the correct price. So we may have a more efficient fleet of cars on the road, just as the change in price of the party of the Students' Union may see some people move from the drinking ticket to the non-drinking ticket. There will be some benefits there, but when it comes to driving and actually creating CO2 emissions, once a person has bought a car under the new regime, they face largely the same costs as they did before. There have been some changes to the annual motor tax, which again are running costs, which are cheaper for more efficient cars. And of course, in recent times, there has been increases in carbon tax. So the creation of burning fossil fuels, creation of carbon dioxide, makes petrol more expensive. And this is directly related to driving. This changes the marginal cost of driving. The cost of making the next trip is higher if the price of petrol increases. So there have been some efforts made to change marginal prices. But sometimes it's important to note the key price that must be changed. People don't respond to average prices. People respond to marginal prices. People are looking forward. If I buy the next unit, how much benefit do I get from that next unit? So if the marginal cost or marginal price is zero, any benefit above zero will lead to the person to use or purchase the product. If the marginal price is positive, they'll weigh up the costs and benefits. What extra benefit do I get from buying this extra unit against the extra cost incurred from the price? So decisions are made at the margin rather than at the average. So it's important to note what prices must be changed in order to influence behaviour. So for example, the government could have imposed a cost on everybody in the country for plastic bags, because look, we're huge costs of dumping, of cleaning up all these plastic bags. We need to collect money to cover this, so we're charging every shopper €25 a year. This money is because you use plastic bags. It is likely that imposing a cost of €25 a year on every shopper would have no impact on plastic bag usage. They're not related. The €25 is essentially a sunk cost. Once somebody has paid the cost, they're free to use as many plastic bags as they were before. But what the government did change was the marginal cost of a bag. That if you want the next bag, it'll cost you 12 cents, and that's what led to the change in behaviour. Over the last year or 18 months or so, there have been suggestions on that we should introduce a water tax. That at present for domestic users, water is provided essentially free. There is no cost or charge for the use of water. And one issue here is that because there's no cost or charge, just like plastic bags, people tend to overuse water. So washing cars, running taps, watering lawns, etc., all using water that has been treated by the local authority and used quite readily. So what one example of this last winter during the cold snaps is people running taps during particularly cold periods. So people are running a tap to try and ensure that their water doesn't freeze. Keep running water in the pipe. But this time you're going from a situation where a tap might be running for at most a couple of minutes a day to now a tap running for 24 hours a day. And if a lot of people do this, reservoirs will be run down very, very quickly. So one argument proposed was that people were essentially wasting a huge amount of treated water just to keep their own taps going, and that there was a cost to everybody else of the huge waste of water. But of course, for the individual household, there was no cost. Water is on demand and is essentially free, so by leaving the tap running, there was no cost to them in the way you face it. So with water, the marginal cost of using water is zero. So there are suggestions that a water charge or water tax should be introduced. But in Ireland we don't have domestic water meters. Unlike electricity and gas, where you know exactly how much has been used by each housing unit, for water, most of them are just simply connected up to the mains and can use as much water as they wish. So in order for the tax to be introduced as a water charge, water metering would have to be introduced. But the proposal is that the tax will be introduced prior to the installation of water meters and still be called a water charge, when in fact it'll have no impact on water usage. That if you charge each household €100 per year and say it's a water charge, it's completely unrelated to water. It's just a household charge. It's just a charge on a house. It won't actually change behaviour in relation to water usage. So just like charging shoppers €25 for their annual plastic bags won't change their behaviour there, charging €100 on households for water will have zero impact on their behaviour. If you wish to change behaviour in relation to water usage, you must change the marginal price. People must pay for the next unit. There must be an additional cost of using the next unit. If the marginal cost is zero, well, people will continue to behave as exactly before. So there will be some suggest that maybe the water charge will be about water conservation, but unless the marginal cost or the marginal price is something above zero, it'll do no such thing. And decisions are made at the margin, and the government must change the marginal cost rather than just imposing a flat or a poll or a household charge tax that has no impact. It's marginal decisions that matter. So there are four economic principles. We'll work through four more in the second class as we introduce some basic concepts before we get into the core material of EC2101. So we'll leave it at that for today.